Welcome everyone to the Amana Bible Institute Developing a Prophetic Language webinar. This evening, myself and Latoya will be presenting presenting this webinar. Basically, it's really all about um, decoding your prophetic language and seeing what God has to say to us, really in everyday life through the scriptures, through friends, through family, whoever that might be. Because God is speaking to us all the time. He may even be speaking to us through the environment, through the trees. So we're just excited to get this webinar going this evening. And we're going to start off with Latoya.
Hi, so thanks for joining. I do want to say this up front. Please feel free to chime in whenever you'd like. You can just unmute yourselves and add your voice to the conversation via comments or questions or whatever you might want to say. And the same with our Facebook audience. Feel free to ask us questions, add to our um, conversation by writing some comments, and we're happy to read those aloud for you so that you can feel as if you are right here in the Zoom conversation with us. And also, if you'd like, just click on that link that's attached to the live video, and you can go ahead and register. It takes 2 seconds, and it will instantly place you in this Zoom meeting with a click of a button. So feel free to do that. So, Professor Onika, actually did an excellent job last Monday discussing all of the ways that God communicates. I just have here a little brief list of many of the ways that God communicates. And I just want to go through this really briefly before going into the next slide. So many of us experience God's communication via dreams and visions. What's spoken of a lot less, though, is other impressions. So that's where I want to spend a little bit of time here. We often do not hear enough about how God uses all of our other senses to communicate with us. The things that we hear, the things that we've already discussed in dreams and visions, images, right? The things that we smell, our taste, our feelings, and also the sixth sense, knowing, right? This bit of intuition. They're just things that we walk around just simply knowing. Um, and we cannot discount that, those brief moments when you just seem to be really amazingly conscious of something as a divine or a form of divine communication. But God also speaks on via circumstances. There are life events that occur that God speaks through. I believe God is speaking quite loudly in the various circumstances of surrounding the nations today, like COVID, this pandemic. And I believe God is also speaking very loudly with all of the racial injustice and the protests that are going on, not just in the United States, but also around the world as well. So God definitely speaks through circumstances. And as Professor Cameron mentioned, God speaks through nature. You can literally hear God's voice if you listen in the wind that blows, in the trees, um, uh, in the animal life that you see, in the insect life that you see. Many of the proverbs of the Bible, in fact, actually utilizes, just basic scientific reasoning concerning um, uh, insect life to help bring wisdom to humans. And really, this wisdom is so great in that it really reminds us of how limited human knowledge and human wisdom really is. There's only so much we can find in ourselves. We actually have to look outside of ourselves in order to find more about life and to understand why we're here and what we're meant to do. And God is communicating those things to us all around, including through nature. God also utilizes messengers to speak to us, whether they are human agents or non human agents. And that's really important too. Um, and last but not least, here, I have that God communicates through scripture. What I really wanted to write here, though, which would have maybe been slightly controversial, is God speaks to us through writings, you know? Because there are writings, there are texts out there that we don't read, that we ought to read because God is speaking through them. So it's not just through scripture, through the Bible, it's not just through this biblical text that we are programmed and heavily exhorted to study on a day-to-day basis. It's also the words of the people around us. Their words should be studied as well. So in Amana, in many of Amana's classes, especially in the biblical studies department, we read a lot of stuff. And in the classes that we're offering in the fall, we're in many of those classes, we're not just focusing on the Bible. We are reading other texts, like in the class Bible, Sex, and Other Texts. We're going to be reading some early Christian texts, some early Jewish texts, because all of these texts actually they come from a tradition received from the Bible, and those texts have things in it that we should know. They have voices in them that we should hear. So God is speaking through all types of texts. So we can't be closed-minded to reading things outside of the Bible. Comments, concerns, questions here?
Yeah, I was gonna say that's really good. I think sometimes we tend to we tend to be very closed off and to be very closed minded, especially in certain traditions. I come from the Holiness Pentecostal, the Black Urban Holiness Pentecostal tradition in the United States, and we tend to be extremely closed off. We believe the Bible is inerrant, and whether you believe it is or not, but to be closed off to other texts, to be closed off to God, speaking to you through other avenues or through other ways, really just kind of box in your spirituality. I mean, it really limits your ability, I think, to hear from God. And so I mean, I think it's just good. I think that the approach, that you guys have started out with, really just kind of dispels really a lot of religious interpretations of what Christianity is or what it means to follow God. That isn't necessarily scriptural in itself or biblical. So
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Totally agree.
I
Totally
do have
agree.
a question as well. And I don't know if it will take us off of our topic here, but would you be able to share with our audience, perhaps someone who might be interested in going beyond the text that we've been programmed to accept and to read? What can you share? Okay, what would be like a great place to start as you're venturing out in terms of reading new texts and different texts?
Yeah, so this is a great question. It's a loaded question too, because there are so many texts out there, so many. I would encourage you to start off with the corpus that you enjoy the most. So if you enjoy New Testament, it might be great for you to read the writings of the church fathers, right? Read some Augustine, read some Jerome, um, read some Pelagius. He's a little wild, but read some Gregory of Nyssa. Read some you really want to read writings where Christian thinkers are actually utilizing the Bible and trying to incorporate some bit of solidified doctrine around the text. A lot of us believe that many of the things that we live into and that we speak of and live out today in Christianity comes from the Bible, but in truth, they come from the church fathers. And so starting there might be helpful if you love the New Testament. They also have really interesting, they're not all right. Read Origin. He's great too. They're not they're not all saying things that are gonna make you feel real good. Some of them are saying some really controversial things. But it's in their controversy. It's in their arguing, they're wrestling with the text that you actually find some bit of enlightenment. And so I would start there. If you really enjoy the Old Testament, read some Old Testament pseudepigrapha. Um, so you want to read the letter of Aristeas, great letter that talks about the how we get a Greek translation of the Torah. It's a fanciful narrative, but it's great. There's Joseph and Asenath. If you love the Genesis narrative with Joseph, read Joseph and Asenath. There's a whole story regarding that. You might love the book of Enoch. Enoch 1 is great, or First Enoch. there's a letter, there's a Baruch, a second Baruch in the Old Testament pseudepigrapha that's pretty great. Second Ezra, um, uh, which is equally great, has some really interesting perspectives of the divine and equally interesting ways of thinking about God's interest in the world. Um, because these texts are often heavily apocalyptic in nature. So they're thinking about those hidden things and often thinking about what it would be like for God or for the sacred to break into the earth. And oftentimes, the idea, this around some kind of peaceful end, at least for the people of God. But nonetheless, really interesting text. And also there's a testament to Moses, there's a testament to Job. So there's a lot of text in Old Testament pseudepigrapha. I'm happy to give you some direct resources with names that you can find online or purchase from Amazon. They are really, really great tools. This, for example, since it's here and I know exactly where it is, it's a 2-volume text that I would encourage you to purchase. It's the Old Testament pseudepigrapha by James Charlesworth. Pretty great text. It has some introductions to each of the books, which will be really helpful to you. Some of this information is going to be unnecessary for confessional learners, but it does help to have some bit of an introduction. The Sibylline oracles, oh my gosh, read those. So there are lots of places where you can start. And I mean, the list can continue. It all depends on your interest. So if you are interested in branching out, send me an email. Let me know what you're interested in, and I'm happy to recommend some direct text for you to start with. I hope that answers your question in some form of a succinct way.
That's a great response, actually. And the reason why I was thinking about that too is as you're talking about decoding, prophetic language and things like that. I think exploring outside the boundaries of the canon we've been given will give us some sense of how that can be done today. So thank you.
Yeah, no, and I couldn't agree more. Like, these texts really explore what it means to be a prophetic scribe. Because a lot of what's happening in these texts is you have this important figure like Moses, like Ezra, who's doing the work of scribing. They are writing down what they're seeing, these really weird things that are happening in this non-earthly place, and they are recording their visitations with angels and things of that nature. And then there are also messengers who write as well. So in some of these texts, you have these angelic figures who are doing the writing for for the human there too. So there's some interesting stuff in those texts, visions, dreams. It's all there. So yeah, I agree. So what's equally important is that all of these forms of divine communication, it's just language. All of this fits under the category of language. And because of that, there is the need to decode them. I think the tendency is to think that certain types of language is easily decoded or doesn't need to be decoded. I'll say it like that. But in truth, all language requires decoding. And I think the thing that we have to realize is that we are doing the work of decoding naturally. And this is why we feel as though some things don't need to be decoding because our brain is already at work. But really, to decode means to make something that is indirect, direct, something that is coded, comprehensible, right? It's natural to us. Our brains have all the equipment that is necessary to naturally decode, right? We are decoding life consistently. And we do this unconsciously, even the process of our breathing. It's done by a series of reactions that require signaling. It's language that's at work deep within our bodies that allow us to do simple things like breathe or send signals to our bellies that we're hungry or something of that nature. Our bodies actually have embedded in them their own natural language as well in order for them to function. So decoding is a very natural process. But it's also important to understand that decoding requires communities. And I have a few sources that will be interesting for you to read, some secondary sources, so that it's not a Bible, it's not a primary source or a sacred text or anything of that nature. But there are some scholars who actually talk about how we form meaning that will be really, really helpful. Stuart Hall has a really great piece, a short piece that you can read if you're interested. I can actually send that to you because I do have a copy of it. But what Stuart Hall emphasizes is that decoding it requires people or a system of people who are actually teaching the coded language. So we know that an image of a tree is a tree or is an image of a tree because we are programmed to think that way. We are taught that way, inculcated to believe that by the world around us, by the society that is teaching us this language as we grow up. So institutional inculcation, whether it's in the family, whether it's through educational institutions, religious spaces, media, huge, huge institution for helping us learn language as well, helps us to decode everything that is in life. And as I mentioned, decoding is something that is so ingrained in every aspect of ourselves that it's something that happens in our bodies, and it's not just something that happens in our bodies, it's something that we almost do instantaneously. We look at an A and we are able to say, hey, that is an A, right? And this is because we've learned language and our minds are naturally inclined to learn languages and to properly decode those messages as we learn them. Decoding also requires the whole self. So I think this is the part that's heavily discounted. You cannot properly decode language if you're not analyzing and contemplating your encounters, your experiences, your desires, your aspirations, your senses, your memories, and as well as your emotions. All of that stuff has to be involved in the process of decoding language, and not just language, like your day-to-day interaction with you and your family, you and your friends, but also your everyday encounters with God requires that you are able to consciously evaluate and examine all of these aspects of yourself in order to properly obtain meaning out of the world. Questions before we move on to decoding in the Bible? Or comments, concerns?
I think I was thinking something came to mind having a programming background, and I was just thinking about everything that we do these days is somehow linked to a computer or a cell phone, and even though that the program is in essence coding the application or something, in essence they're actually decoding it for everyone to understand what is happening. So that is just some sort of an example of how it maybe look like practically how we're doing it all the time, like you were mentioning now.
Yeah, definitely. I have math and science undergraduate degrees, and yeah, one of the first things you start to realize is, man, calculators only do what you tell them to do. Like, you have to program them to do what you want them to do, or they're going to give you the wrong answer. They only output what you input. So yeah, it's all circular. We are constantly working through codes, through coded languages, in order to live and exist in the world. And it's the decoding of those coded messages that actually enable us to do that work. So totally agree. I took a programming class like once. I'm proud of you, Cam, because it's craziness. Programming is not easy. You have to find like the little, the small little error that's like I don't know, it's surrounded by everything that looks normal. So it's so hard to find where you made a mistake when you're coding. So it takes
Absolutely.
a really great mind to do that work. But decoding occurs in the Bible all the time. And we just brush over these narratives because they're great narratives and we want to get out the key aspects of them. And for us, that's like, man, Daniel's dope, right? That's often what we want to get out of these narratives. Moses is great. Oh, God really loved Joseph, right? But those messages are somewhat surface if we're not permitting ourselves to actually think through the process, or actually we're not allowing ourselves to situate ourselves into the text enough to actually go through the process of decoding what we read. And a lot of these things that we are that requires decoding, well, the whole text requires decoding, but a lot of these texts that we are constantly visiting for dreams, visions, other impressions, we often just find some kind of peace in that there was interpretation, but we don't actually think about the work of interpretation. And so I just want to spend a little bit of time, not necessarily workshopping the interpretation process, but showing how, or illustrating how aspects of the person is effective in that interpretation process. So as you can probably tell, this class is, as we're talking about decoding prophetic language, this is not a dream clinic. We're not attacking this from any type of traditional standpoint. This is all about you using every bit of skill and equipment you have to do the work of decoding your own dreams. There is no one science to this process of decoding life or decoding prophetic messages. But one thing that is sure is it requires you. So we're going to talk a lot about you and the person who's receiving the message themselves, and how their context, how their experiences and encounters themselves aid in the process of decoding. So in Zechariah 1 through 6, Zechariah's identity in itself is what works in the process of decoding. Unlike other prophets in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, Zechariah stands out as really interesting because he is not just simply a mediator. Other prophets have been mediators and they've stood between the people and God, but Zechariah, his mediation abilities is somewhat limited in that he is standing between God, a divine messenger, and the people. So everything that Zechariah receives, and by the way, he has 8 visions. They all happen in one night. And his messages, his communication itself is not necessarily with God. It's with a divine messenger. And this very much, it varies, it differs from the experiences of, say, Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 1, which I want to go to actually. So if you have your Bibles, turn to Jeremiah 1. Yeah, and it actually starts in verse 11. After Jeremiah receives this bit of identity or these words regarding his purpose, he actually has a vision. And this chapter right here, and it's verses 11 and 12, even it's really verses 11 to 13. This is a really great example of what a vision report is in the Bible, and they occur a lot, but this is probably one of the better examples where there's this idea that the prophet sees something, and then there is some kind of interpretation that follows, and often a dialogue in between. Zechariah's dialogues in his vision reports occur with an intermediary, a divine intermediary, not with God. Jeremiah's occurs with God. So Jeremiah says, or the book of Jeremiah says in chapter 1, verse 11, the word of the Lord came to me saying, Jeremiah, what do you see? And I said, I see a branch of an almond tree. Then the Lord said to me, you have seen well, for I am watching over my word to perform it. Your mind is supposed to say at this moment, what? How does the branch of an almond tree signify God watching over God's word to perform? Like, what? That's what your mind is meant to do. But to Jeremiah's hearers, this would have made sense because it would have been read in Hebrew. And the Hebrew of the term almond tree and the Hebrew for the term watch sound very much alike. So it's actually a pun. It's a play on of words here that's occurring in the book of Jeremiah that you're only going to know if you look in the Hebrew. Nonetheless, in this vision report, you have God asking Jeremiah, what do you see? Jeremiah saying, hey, God, I see so-and-so. And then God interpreting. This is actually a type of mode of interpretation that is seen constantly. In this case, Jeremiah doesn't really have to interpret much of anything. It is God who was doing the interpreting. But Jeremiah does have a role, right? God gives him this. I'm watching over my word to perform it. Jeremiah's job at that point becomes, what is the word, or becomes a series of asking a series of questions. What is the word? What do I do with it? Right? And we know that this is a word that Jeremiah speaks throughout the book of Jeremiah, which causes him deep pain. There's another vision report in the next verse. The word of the Lord came to me a second time, saying, what do you see? And I said, I see a boiling pot tilted away from the north. And then the Lord said to Jeremiah, out of the north disaster shall break out on all the inhabitants of the land. And then gives Jeremiah further in interpretation of the word. So in these two chapters, in Jeremiah and both Zechariah, there is some kind of divine intermediary, whether it is God's self, or some kind of divine messenger that's doing somewhat the work of decoding, but then the responsibility still falls on the prophet to do something about that. Nonetheless, in Daniel chapter 2, what we get knowledge. We get Daniel just simply divinely knowing things. This is a chapter that you might be familiar with. In Daniel chapter 2, we get the king Nebuchadnezzar having a dream, and he is tormented by this dream. He asks the wise men to come, and he challenges them to not just interpret the dream, but to tell him what he saw. And there is no one who was able to do this except Daniel. And this is the thing, the wise men were going to be killed. And that would have included Daniel and his friends if none of them were able to fulfill this task. It is Daniel using this divine potential of knowledge to not only give the interpretation or give the dream, recount the dream to Nebuchadnezzar, but to provide interpretation of the dream itself. We get something similar, except that, he doesn't have to necessarily recount the dream in Genesis chapter 41 with Joseph, right? Joseph and Daniel have very, very similar narratives. What becomes really important, not only with knowledge, not only with some kind of divine intermediary, or the help of a divine intermediary, what becomes really helpful in decoding dreams is also the social context. And what we often forget about in the Bible is that, especially in the Old Testament, these people are living in an agrarian society, right? And because of this, a lot of what we read in the text is agrarian language, you guys. Few of us live in agrarian societies. And because of that, some of this language that's in the Bible is really hard for us to understand, and we often use it in really poor ways because we don't completely understand what it would have been like to live in this type of society. So we find shepherding language in chapter 34 of Ezekiel, which talks about really God is rising as Israel's shepherd. And those were supposed to be words of comfort for an exiled people. And then what we find in Genesis chapter 37, which is an actual vision that Joseph has of his brothers, right? His brothers being sheaves of wheat and bowing down to Joseph's sheep or whatnot. Um, it's the language of harvest, and it's because this is the world that Joseph and his brothers would have been surrounded by and around. This is the world that they thoroughly lived in. And so you find this language at work in the text, and it's completely normal. For us, we would be like, why would you use a sheath of wheat? Like, why would I see that, God? I don't understand, But for Joseph, this would have made complete sense. Um, in addition to all of this, we find aspects of the self. So identity, self-identity at work in the text. So in Genesis chapter 40, when Joseph does the work of interpreting the dreams of the baker and the cupbearer for Pharaoh, it is the case that in their dreams they are fulfilling their earthly role in their dreams, right? So the baker, the chief baker, is baking. The chief the chief cupbearer is doing something regarding his bearing or cup bearing for the king. And so it's not abnormal that they would see themselves in this position, in the same, or existing in their earthly identity in this dream. And then lastly, the sun, moon, and stars. Context matters, you guys. A lot of people don't make this connection in Genesis 37, also one of Joseph's dreams, about his father as the sun, his mother as the moon, his brothers as the stars, and they're all bowing down to him. We often think, oh yeah, Joseph had that dream, but in actuality, it's important for us to think about why he would have seen this type of imagery. There are lots of texts, Old Testament pseudepigraphical texts that suggest that a lot of the founding of astrology and things of that nature is connected to Joseph's lineage. So, really his ancestors' lineage, so Abraham and Egypt and things of that nature. But in addition to that, what we have in Genesis chapter 12, Genesis chapter 15, is a promise, a covenant established with Abraham that says that Abraham's descendants will be like the sand on the sea or like the stars in the sky, right? Talking about the multiplicity of his descendants. And then we get Joseph actually seeing his brothers as stars. And by the way, Abraham's covenant is fulfilled through Joseph and his brothers. It is Jacob's sons who produce the children of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, who branch out and have children who have more children who have more children. So we have this bit of covenantal language embedded in Joseph's dream, and it is intentionally there. Joseph, in so many ways, being the elected one of his brothers, saving his brothers and his family as a whole from famine, and fulfilling not only the Abrahamic covenant, but the prophecy given to Abraham that his descendants will be slaves in Egypt for 400 years. Right? How do they get there? Joseph. So there's a lot of stuff that's embedded in these dreams that actually reveal a history, a past history, right? And so sometimes understanding of your past, and your past includes the past of your parents, your grandparents, is really helpful in decoding the circumstances of your life, or decoding the messages that God is giving you, whether it's through dreams, visions, or any other type of impressions. Questions, comments, concerns here? Okay, so let's go into best practices. So there are lots of things that one should keep in mind when attempting to decode these messages. First off, life is all about exploration. You have to live your life understanding that everything has deeper meaning. You have to be willing to explore everything. Everything requires exploration. And the willingness needs to be, your willingness needs to be in seeking everything out. God is in everything. And so if it helps, think about God as being in the very things that you are exploring. Because God is there. Look for God there. Make it a search for God in everything. Another thing that helps is journaling. And man, this is a element that really helps me actually. I don't know that any of this will be possible, even Amana itself, without the work of journaling. So one thing that you want to do when you're receiving divine communications, and not just divine communications, but just journaling in general, you want to take really good notes and be really specific, not leaving anything out, because nothing is insignificant in a communication. Nothing. That includes your emotions, your thoughts before, during, and after the experience. It includes your current circumstances. It includes the encounters that preceded that divine encounter or that followed that divine encounter. It includes all of the impressions that you've been receiving in that small period of time, whether it's a matter of days or weeks or even months, because all of that stuff is relative. And it's often the case that they're related to one another and they form one larger story. So from my own personal experience, I take notes all the time off of the things, the impressions that I receive, and I'm not an artist at all. Like, I'm not a visual artist. I've done almost everything in the performing arts except art classes, and it's because I suck at art. I am not good at it at all. But for some reason, some of the things, the impressions that I get cannot be put in words. I have to draw them. And so I've been like drawing for several several years now. People in church probably think I doodle in church because I'm always drawing, and they probably think I'm so like disengaged, but I promise I'm not. But ultimately, the work of drawing and journaling really helps me process and synthesize what I am seeing or feeling or getting in a consciousness or being conscious of. And what it also allows me to do is when I exit the encounter, being able to go back to what I've drawn or I've written allows me to go back into the encounter, which allows me to further experience whatever God was communicating. So oftentimes when I draw pictures, that picture in itself, it's like drawing that picture. It does the work that your camera would do when you are capturing a moment. You know how you can minimize or you can maximize the photo to check to see if your teeth are white or what's that mark on your face kind of thing. Drawing the encounter itself and writing the encounter equally kind of allows you to minimize and maximize the images that you're seeing in so many ways. You start to see things that you didn't see in that first encounter. It's a furthering of the encounter itself. So divine communication continues when you do your due diligence, when you take notes, when you journal, and when you allow yourself to, get rid of all of the really interesting doubts that come in. So this process is also really confusing in that it we all know that one thing that human minds do really well is imagine, right? But imagination is important. It's key. God utilizes our imaginations, you guys. Like, it is not something that we can just throw in back of us. It's not something that we can just push away. It is something that has to be embedded in our everyday life. It is active. It is something that is necessary in the process of exploration. And so don't allow those doubts of whether God is communicating to you to stand in the way of God furthering the encounter. And taking notes, drawing, doodling it out really has a way of helping with that. Another thing you want to do, and this is actually something I just started doing a few months ago, draw some conclusions, you guys. Make some conclusions. I have like notebooks full of stuff, and I make conclusions based upon individual experiences, but it wasn't until most recently that I started making conclusions about multiple impressions that all seem to relate and tell a similar narrative. And it was in doing that that, not only did I gain this larger perspective concerning this particular communication, but I'm writing a book based upon those conclusions. And so, I'm gonna have like a whole work based upon really just doing my due diligence and synthesizing these God communications, these God encounters. And you guys can do that too. So make sure you actually take some time out to think about how these encounters relate to one another and to actually sit down and synthesize your thoughts. Another thing you want to do is you want to maintain very, very clear airways between you and God. Both you and God is central to the process of interpretation. So if you are closed off, or if you are restricting yourself from hearing from God, and not just God in self, but God outside of self, you're going to be hindering the process of decoding. So you want to keep clear airways, clear highway, right, in communication. Also, remember, you don't live in a bubble. You really don't. So the community and the world around you really matters. God encounters are not just for you. As you experience God encounters that might specifically relate to issues in your life, it is the impact of you that impacts your community or your communities, which impacts the world at large, is how you want to think about it. But also, God just doesn't communicate to us about us. God communicates to us about the people around us, about the circumstances around us, and those things have to be considered too. So don't be selfish. It ain't all about you. It's almost never about you in that case, even when it is about you. There's always a bigger picture. So keep the big picture in mind. Last but not least, reading is fundamental, you guys. Read your Bible. Read your Bible, you guys. The Bible is really helpful in helping you to decode these messages and decoding life. And a lot of people specifically use the Bible as a form of interpreting dreams, like finding numbers, the meaning of numbers and stuff. But really, we all have our own dream language, and the Bible is only going to lend so much help to that process. Like, you have to realize that you have a dream language, and it is up to you to explore that dream language that God is establishing with you. Your memories, your past encounters have everything to do with your own personal dream language. But the Bible is super helpful in helping you to understand the things that might help you to locate, to find your own personal dream language, and to do the process of decoding. You also want to read other books. There are really great books out there, but you want to be careful, because remember, we all have our own dream language. So someone's dream manual that tells you that serpent means, I don't know, entrapment, deception, that might not be what the serpent means in your dream, or in your vision, or in your impression. It might mean life and health, because everything, there's no black and white in the world. There's only really gray. And I know this is really controversial, but it's all gray. God lives in the gray. And if you want to find God, you got to be willing to live in the gray. You got to be willing to wrestle with everything, because it's all gray. The serpent is not just a symbol of deception, and it's also a symbol of life and healing. Think about the serpent in our own medical history. The symbol of medicine is a serpent, and that didn't just start with us. Let's go to Numbers chapter 21, 22, right? Where we find the people bitten by poisonous serpents that God sent upon them for their disobedience. And it is the same item that was used to poison the people that is used to bring healing. Moses constructs a brazen serpent. They look upon it and they are healed. And then later on in Greco-Roman history, we see the serpent is used as an element of healing, an icon, an idol of healing. And then now in our society, medicine, the symbol of medicine, happens to be a serpent on a staff. Brazen serpent, you guys, from Numbers, it's there, So read. And don't be afraid to engage, to actively engage. Ask questions of the sources that you are reading. That's everything, including the Bible. So read. Other people's works matter, communities matter in that case. But you also want to read your own life. Like regularly read yourself, examine yourself, your desires, your aspirations, your memories. You know, the reason why some people can walk around the world and smell certain things and receive impressions through smell is because they smell something and then it reminds them of a past memory. And then it is that past memory that helps them to decode what God is communicating, right? Don't be afraid of those kind of things. Examine your memories, your desires, your aspirations, your emotional states, your afflictions, your connections, the people you are connected to, because all of that matters. Okay, I think I'm done. Professor Cam, take it away.
Okay. I don't know this, how much of this is decoding or how much of it is actually in the Bible. But the reason why I kind of brought this topic up, decoding the prophetic through the lens of oppression and injustice, because currently in the world we've got so much injustice, and the topic is kind of spoken about really often. And that's pretty much as far as it goes in most cases, it's just being spoken about. But in the scriptures, there's many scriptures that is speaking about the topic of injustice and oppression. If I think of Isaiah, um, Isaiah is referring to we need to we need to do what is right, to learn what is right. We need to defend the oppressed and take up the cause of the fatherless and plead for the widow. If I look at Micah, we need to act justly and to love mercy and walk humbly with God. If I just think of those two scriptures, these are very clear scriptures in the Bible that is speaking, is giving us as Christians an indication of how we are to live with one another and what we are supposed to do. And I think of what is happening in our world right now is what's happening now, perhaps a precursor of what is to come. Because if I think about Jesus, he really stands in solidarity with the poor, with the marginalized, and those that are being oppressed. And if we're not going to kind of follow his instruction, are we heading down a path of destruction? Um, so, not that we want to be pessimistic about the topic of injustice, but the scriptures actually give us a clear guideline of what we need to be doing. And in fact, if we're not doing that, are we not perhaps just being disobedient to the will of God in some sense? Um, if I think about reparations, the scripture speaks clearly about reparations as well. If I think of Exodus 21, where the slaves served their masters for 6 years, and then thereafter they were set free. If they came with their wife and children, their wife and children was also set free, and they went away without paying anything. Um, when I think of Zacchaeus in the Bible, he gave 4 times what he's um, taken from the poor. So is that perhaps not what we should be doing when we're talking about reparations? Or are we just speaking about the reparations and not actually willing to act and do as the scriptures leading us to do? And then when I think about Jesus and his voice not being palatable, the scripture speaks about Jesus wasn't welcome in his own town. In some ways, I can really say that perhaps that is not palatable, because the message of Jesus is in fact not one that is very palatable to many people, even for us Christians, because what he expects of us to do is sometimes far a greater exercise than what we can possibly bear. Um, so so what are we going to as followers of Christ, what are we actually intending to do? And if I think about where we're staying at the moment, and even in the US, when it comes to issues of injustice and oppression, uh, people are actually becoming angry in society because this level the level of oppression just seems to be ongoing. People getting killed, people not having food, people not having a roof over their head. Is that just not a precursor of what is to come? Is God using all the people who are marginalized and who are oppressed in some ways to be speaking to those or the powers that be to say that things has to come right because my God is going to address the situation, and when he does, it's not a very comforting situation that we're going to be heading towards. I think we can go to the next slide. I don't know if there's any questions regarding those three or any so if I think about the Israelites who suffered oppression in Exodus 1, and I think of Moses who pleaded with Pharaoh to set the people free. Really, the Israelites at the time, and let's call it God's people, because in some ways we are God's people. Um, Not necessarily only the Jews these days, but the Gentiles as well. So we are all God's people, and we may be suffering some sort of injustice, prejudice, or oppression. And the people that I'm mentioning that are speaking out against injustice or doing or protesting, are they not the Moses today? Perhaps they fulfilling the role of Moses while the pharaohs sit back and just listen to this, and they're not prepared to do anything for the people in order to improve their circumstances. And then if I think of Pharaoh's heart being hardened, if I think about now I'm not in any way saying that all wealthy people are bad, or all governments are necessarily bad, or they oppress their nations. But perhaps though the powers that be who's able to influence and make change in society and to make things better for those that are on the margins, perhaps their hearts are being hardened, whether it's being hardened by themselves or actually being hardened by God. And is it perhaps the coronavirus that is not maybe the first plague? Not to be a conspiracy theorist or anything like that, but I mean, if you look at what's happening in our society with the coronavirus, we're on lockdown, we're imprisoned pretty much in our homes. We have to wear masks all day. Certain instances, we can't buy certain products. Um, People are struggling. People are suffering even more. People are losing their jobs. Is that not a sign that something needs to be made right in our society, that everybody is actually in fact equal and treated with dignity and some sort of a respect? Um, so perhaps that's what God is speaking to those. And if I just think about one's voice not being palatable, if I think of the Jesus and him saying things that is uncomfortable, often we say, if I think about the church, we often said that your voice is not palatable for this place, but especially when it comes around the message of injustice or making things right, reparations that needs to take place in our society. But is the person who's actually bringing that message, that uncomfortable message, is God perhaps not using that individual in some way to forewarn our communities that we need to do what is right, regardless of where the community is, who the community is, because there's always someone that may be struggling or being in a more difficult place than what we may be. So yeah, there is just some thoughts around oppression and social justice. I think we can go on to the next slide if there's not any comments.
I do have a question, and I may be jumping ahead a tad bit, so forgive me if I am. So I understand your correlation between, what's happening in our world today and the various places that oppression is showing up, and how we can correlate that with some of the oppression that we've seen taking place in the Bible. I guess my question around that, since we're talking about decoding prophetic messages, so to speak, I'd like to understand from your perspective how then does the understanding this or making this correlation lend itself to us being able to decode prophetic messages?
I think if I'm understanding you correct, are you referring to the scriptures specifically used as a tool to decode it, or are you just referring to what we're seeing in our current society at the moment?
No, I'm kind of piggybacking off of what you're sharing now. So you're laying the groundwork for us to understand that what we see in our world today sort of can be related back to what we see in the biblical text. I kind of want to push you a little bit further for you to help us understand then, how does this new understanding, or how does understanding that what we see today is nothing new, it's been around before, how does that understanding lend itself to us being able to decode prophetic messages that we're getting from God today? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. I'm gonna attempt to answer your question. I think pretty much like we're seeing in the scriptures that there is many instances of injustice, and I think it just goes around having to read our scriptures and understanding it from various perspectives. I mean, if I think about um, in the scriptures maybe 10 years ago, read the scripture once again, um, or maybe a few times again, and actually interpret the scriptures and look at it in a way that now I'm seeing that, look, but God is actually speaking and is for or is against injustice, and is for fairness, if I want to put it that way. But I don't know if I'm maybe necessarily answering your question correctly, but if I didn't read outside of the scriptures alone, and I didn't have a community that I was involved with and that I'm speaking around the issues of injustice, I don't think I would have come to the same conclusion about the scriptures and in the interpretation of the scriptures that I am doing today or right now. So it kind of goes back to what Latoya was saying. We need to be reading additional material with the scriptures, as well as being hearing what our community is saying, because we're not working in isolation with one another, and then come to that conclusion. And in some sense, I think that in many instances, when we're talking about injustice in some churches, I think that is what where we're lacking in some sense. We're not necessarily we're reading the scriptures, but we don't have the community. We're not in solidarity with one another, standing together with one another to understand what are we actually speaking about when we're speaking about injustice. And we're not reading additional books, and perhaps we're not even living in a place of discomfort um, to see and actually feel what someone else is actually feeling, um, who has been oppressed, who has worked on the farm where the farmer throws the ice in the sand and then expects the people to pick it up and eat it. But once we're living in that, I think God opens our eyes to actually see that this is what I'm for. I mean, not me, but I mean in God's sense, this is what I'm for. I came for the oppressed. I came for those who are marginalized and on the margins. Um, so yeah, I'm not too sure if that is making sense.
Yeah, that answers my question. Yeah, we're much closer. Yes, I understand. Thank you.
I just want to say something really quick. I really enjoy this lens of things, Professor Cam, because I think the thing that we often forget that I try my best to keep reminding people of in the classes that I teach for ABI is that the Bible has a voice, or not just a voice, but multiple voices. And I think what you are sharing right now is about the importance of us being able to hear the voice of the text, the voices within the text, and the importance of us being able to understand that those voices within the text are central, like they are also divine encounters in themselves. They're God encounters that have to be decoded, and many of those voices have something to say about social injustice, um, has something to say about the role of the body of Christ, has something to say about oppression in this society. And I think what you're adding to that is really interesting too, because decoding the text, I always teach that decoding the text requires the social context of the text itself. It requires that you immerse yourself in the world of the text. And but you're bringing across another aspect of it, which comes in, I would say, comes into play after you figured out the social context of the text and the meaning that the text has for its original hearers, is, hearing what the text has to say about the world around you by utilizing the world around you, the experiences that you have in the world, the people you're connected to, your endeavors, your day-to-day endeavors, and determining what the word itself is saying to you, about your own social context, which I think is dope. This is really important, and it's definitely something, a work that we need to be consistently doing. So I just want to say thanks, for this lens.
Pleasure. I think on this slide, I pretty much kind of presented it in the first one, but if I think about, okay, we kind of spoke about who could be the pharaohs today. We spoke about standing in solidarity, um, with one another. And is our church is actually modeling this? Are we modeling Jesus as we're standing in solidarity with one another? These are just questions that I'm asking. And then, who's Moses today? And are we fulfilling this role? Um, has our hearts been hardened towards the issue of injustice? And then, what is it going to really take for God to get our attention, to know that He's actually there in the trees, in the flowers, in what we're seeing around us, in our communities that we are? What is it going to take before He gets our attention? And that kind of is maybe going to lead into the next slide, which is more perhaps a personal example, um, and more maybe reflective, perhaps a testimony. I don't know. Um, but I'm going to share something that is really related to me, and I think about it. So I'm kind of going down to the personal example on this slide. If I think about possibly 10 years back, I pursued a theological qualification, and at the time, I kind of did it because I always felt years back that I was wanting to do something ministry related, but that opportunity never really came about because of the circumstances that our people as a colored community in South Africa really faces, because being people that is on the margins and always struggling, pursuing some sort of theological education is not really the natural thing that we're going to be doing. But needless to say, about 10 years back, after I completed a few other courses, I pursued a theological education. At the time, I was at the church that wasn't really willing to have me speak or even get experience in terms of speaking or preaching in the community. And following on to that, I kind of really put myself into the career mode and really pushed ahead to try defy the odds that our people really suffers as a people of color living in South Africa and what we experience on a day-to-day basis in order to kind of maybe achieve wealth, if you want to put it that way, or just have a better standard of living, perhaps. And I always felt that I needed to be doing something, but the career was kind of the primary focus, and I began moving at a very fast pace, and God was speaking to me all along through each one of these things. He was speaking through my friends. He perhaps was speaking through scriptures, even perhaps a life event. And I think of friends just been telling me, Cam, you need to slow down. You need to slow down. My folks was telling me, you need to slow down. My wife, slow down. But Cam is just heading. He's heading. Where he's heading to, he doesn't know, but he's heading somewhere. And eventually, in January 2019, God actually brought me to a dead stop um, in my life and my career, whereby I was involved in a motorcycle accident that actually changed my entire life. Um, in many ways, it affected my mobility, my movement. It affected my job, and a lot more than just what you see. You see me sitting here today, but you don't see what's happening down in my foot, for example. But he kind of brought me to that stop, and I'm not knowing what is happening, but I know that definitely God is speaking, and it's not that he did anything wrong. It was probably more positive, um, if I go through the personal experience. And I think the positive is that a former professor connected me or hooked up with me, Dr. Gabe. He called me up in February again, and we started chatting. And then I started meeting other guys in the US. One of them eventually being called, who's on the group at the moment, one of the professors at Amana, called and introduced me to Latoya. And today I'm presenting this course or this webinar for Amana Bible Institute in the US, having been told 10 years ago, or even more recent than 10 years ago, that your voice is not palatable for this church. So it's just amazing how God actually works. He makes things that may seem bad, and he turns that into a positive. And perhaps at each moment, I didn't see how God was speaking and how God was moving the pieces. Um, but if I'm looking and preparing for this webinar today, I actually realized, but this is God all along. God has been speaking to me through my friends, through scriptures, through a life event, through friends that I've met, and this is kind of where I am sitting today. So the prophetic is is really important. Sometimes we end up reading the scriptures just for the sake of reading the Bible, to say that, no, I've read my Bible today, but I think we need to read it a little bit deeper, even when we're reading some other material, like Professor Latoya mentioned earlier. God speaks even through that. He speaks through anything. Even he may even speak through other religious texts as well. Um, but I don't think we should negate anything, because he's there and he's all around us at all times. So that is just kind of a personal example of how God has been speaking in my life, and how I've only recently kind of decoded and made sense of where God is taking me, and what He's intending um, for me to do or become one day. So yeah, that's a personal experience. I think
Awesome. Thank you so much for your testimony, and for sharing your own personal experience. Um, I want I want us to take part in an activity that would allow us to do what you did um in as you were preparing for this webinar, actually, as a prophetic activity. So I want us to examine our lives by considering a past encounter. It could be a dream, a vision, any type of impression or consciousness that you had. It could be a life event or several life events, as Professor Cameron shared. And I want you to draft it. So if you've come to this webinar and you don't have anything in hand, those who came to our past webinar were told this assignment will come up. So if you don't have it in hand, take 2 minutes to record whatever you're going to discuss. And it can just be bullet points. It doesn't have to be specific for this purpose. If you brought it with you, just reread it. I want you to add to it. Add the details you left out, the details you thought were insignificant, like where you were. Your setting matters. You know, where you receive your impression really does matter. So write down all the details that you left out. And it can be something as simple as, while I was sitting on the couch at my grandma's house, you know, I saw ... right? And then I want you to decode. And obviously, we can't go through decoding the entire experience right here on this live because we'll be here forever. But I want you to start the work of decoding. Think about where the symbolic language might be, or the language that might seem straightforward, but is actually slightly symbolic. And think about what God is saying. It can just be in that in one small instance of the encounter. And then last but not least, I want you to select one or two aspects of that encounter and its interpretation to share with us. If you don't want to share the encounter or the decoding process, what you can do is you can just share with us how it felt to have to, you know, record or follow these instructions, record the encounter, add insignificant details, and what it might have felt like or what it feels like to actually think about that message as being something that God is saying to you for now. Like, you don't have to actually, if your encounter is too personal, you don't have to share. So I want to give you a few minutes to do that. And Cam and I will take part as well. So we'll just give a few minutes, you know, to think. Okay, so are we ready? Okay, so I'll go ahead and start, just in case you guys are still writing, unless you want to start, Professor Cam, even though you already kind of gave us one, but So, I guess I'll start.
Yeah,
So, ABI's birth actually is the thought that came to mind. I was de-churched for about six years until most recently, this past January, actually. Um, and yeah, there were like three distinct places um, that or events at places, and the same feelings or the same mental experience in those three distinct spaces that led me to being de-churched. So for the most part, for me, it was not a matter of being or experiencing church hurt. I mean, we all experience that. But for me, it was more so this feeling of hopelessness. I was receiving like God encounters that were cluing me in on like issues that were going on not only in the local church but in the body of Christ at large, and it was just becoming really unbearable, and it was becoming even the more unbearable living and existing regularly participating in a local church and feeling like nothing was happening. So I felt this bit of hopelessness. I felt like I needed to create a change, to make a change, but I couldn't. um, I was really I was really drawn to this lack of fellowship that was really occurring in these places that we literally swear fellowship happens in. um, and just really felt this hopelessness when it comes to, or as it relates to being able to affect change within the body of Christ by being a part of a local church. So I decided that, I was gonna, I still do people and I still do church and I still do God, but I'm gonna just, sit out here for a little bit. Because I was born and raised in the church, and I had learned, I've been inculcated to serve and give pretty much my all to churches. And so it was taking all of my time, all of my energy, and to feel that hopelessness in working like a slave, was just not very healthy for me. So I needed to take a hiatus and get my mind right with God, and also figure out what God expects of me, because God is showing me all this stuff and I'm like, whoa, God, what do I do with this stuff, there was a series of events that occurred the moment I decided I would be de-churched. I was looking for a seminary to go to in Georgia for years. I had done hundreds of searches for a seminary, but it wasn't until I was de-churched and did another search, the same old Google search for a seminary, that I found Columbia Theological Seminary. And they happened to be having a seminary weekend that was free of charge the weekend after. So I instantly called my mom. I said, look, Mom, we're going to this thing. Come with me. And we went, and I absolutely loved it. I found out there that they had a scholarship I could apply for, and I applied. I think the scholarship was due in like 2 weeks. I applied for the school, applied for the scholarship, and got in on a full ride, including room and board being covered. So that was one event that got kind of affirmed, hey, you're heading in the right direction. Then, towards during those 2 years that I was there, knowing exactly what I wanted to do, demanding that every bit of lesson I was learning at this school in my classes, demanding that they would prepare me for PhD work, because that's what I wanted to do. And I only had 1 year to prepare, since you have to apply a year before. I ran into people like Onika, who affirmed me, even though I didn't have a church, who became community for me. I also created other aspects of community. I created For example, um, uh, like a liturgical dance class where we were able to come together, pray together, develop dances. You know, it was a smaller community. So I was learning how to create additional methods of fellowship. And I was experiencing really great fellowship with Onika and with many of my other friends, and able to really effectively have church without being in a church, and still grow as a person. It was at towards the end of my seminary degree that I actually was enlightened to start this school, a school that had already been on my dream in my dream notebook for several years, since maybe like 2010 or something like that. But it wasn't until 2016 that I was like, yo, I'm gonna do this. And I developed everything in a month, including having a location where we can offer our summer classes that was given to us free of charge. So God affirmed again, not only through getting me into school, getting me started on this path to being a Bible scholar, but allowing me to come in contact with really amazing people, and allowing me to God affirming this school by opening doors and giving us access to spaces and to students. And here we are 4 years later. Um, as an official nonprofit, switched our classes on from a free platform to a monetized platform. And we've gone from 2 instructors to 6 instructors in 6 months. And instructors who I didn't vet, they just kind of reached out to me, which is another event of God affirming this school. So really, this school has been in the works for many years, and through 10 years, I would say, of experiences. Um, Starting out with the first experience of writing that I will have a school 10 years ago. And then, up until now, and the experience is continuing. So I hope that makes sense. Do you guys have something that you want to share? People on Facebook, would you like to share your experience and your moment of decoding? Okay. I know we have quite a few people here on the Zoom call who are, not in a position to write, like they might be driving or something like that, like Onika. So, so we won't push you. But if you do have something that you'd like to share with us, please do send it to our email, amanabibleinstitute@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your encounters. We'd love to gauge the effectiveness of these activities. And we'd love to have your feedback as well. So give us your comments, give us your questions, give us your suggestions for not just webinars that we can do in the future, but courses that you want to take with us, and things that you want us to just randomly talk about. Another thing you can do is you can actually come to our webinar 1 week from today and actually ask whatever you want in a session called Come Ask and Grow with Us. So we're going to have as many of our staff here as possible, and we just want you to be able to ask your questions, and we just want to have a candid conversation about whatever you want to talk about. We can talk about the things that we've discussed in these webinars so far, or we can discuss biblical interpretation. We can discuss what we might be thinking about what's happening in the world. It doesn't matter. We're going to allow you to come ask whatever you want to ask, and we want to hear what you have to say. We want this to be a discussion. No PowerPoint, no formalized format. We just want you to come in and ask your questions. So we'll go ahead and release our meeting information to you guys for next week. Anyone on Facebook, for you to just come in and ask your questions, or you can ask your questions and make your comments here on Facebook as we will be live. But before you do that, come back on Monday and experience Professor Onika as she discusses developing your prophetic language part 3. I believe this session is all going to be about receptivity. What do you do after the process of decoding and receiving the word? Like, what do you do? But I don't know. She always has lots of really amazing tools in her backpack. So come and figure out what those are. In addition to that, um, you should come back for a session on prophetic intercession, also taught by Professor Onika. And lastly, come to our open houses, which will be held towards the end of the month. Well, actually, towards the middle of August, August 17th and August 15th, I believe. And we're just really going to allow our professors to be here for a period of time where we can come in. We'll split you guys up into breakout rooms and we'll allow students to individually and personally talk to various instructors about their classes. There will be a perk. So if you do come and you register while in the open house, you will receive a larger discount than the one you receive for coming to this webinar. And we're offering a ton of really great courses. So here are perspective courses. Well, they're not perspective anymore. They are definitely happening, and they are online and available for you to register as of today. So you can go to our website, amanabibleinstitute.net, and you can find out all of the courses that we're teaching and with their descriptions and when we're teaching them, which is excellent. There's also a Word document there that allows you to see what courses work for various certificate programs and the actual instructor's name who will be teaching it. So please do check out our website. In term 1, we are offering biblical languages. Come and take Hebrew with me or Greek with Professor Onika. It's going to be great. We're going to start exploring biblical languages. They're really fun to learn. So please come. It's work, but it's good work, and it's going to feel good after you take part 2 and you can actually read the text for yourself. Come also in terms 2 and 3, in terms 1A, and learn how to write your books. We have a great book coach, Miss Miranda, who will be discussing book writing 101. We're also offering the social 101, which is all about using social media effectively to expand your business or ministry. We have a course on prayer taught by Professor Onika in term 2. And we have a course on marketplace ministry. So we're talking about fivefold offices as they exist outside of the church, which is really great because it's often the case that these offices are viewed as offices that are restricted to use in the church, but they are not. They exist outside of it. So come learn more about that in term 3. So last but not least, we have a few certificate programs. We have 6 to be exact, 3 advanced and 3 basic. And we have 3 concentrations or 3 areas: biblical languages, biblical studies, and Christian ministries. We're really excited to launch specializations in our Christian ministries program, including one on church administration. So for all of you church planters, come and take our church administration certificate. It's going to be great. We are already developing courses for that, and 1 or 2 of those courses will be offered this fall. Also come and learn more about media ministries. You can also take a prophetic artistry certificate, learning how to utilize your art form, even if it's in creative writing or something of that nature, for healing of the self and healing of the world at large. And prophetic intercession, which has many faces. It's not all about prayer. So come learn with us, grow with us. These programs are not long. They're very short programs. There are payment options as low as $60 a month available, and they take as little as 6 to 12 months to complete. So find out more information on our website, amanabibleinstitute.net. Any questions, comments, or concerns before we leave? Okay, well, in that case, I hope you guys have a great day, and we hope to see you on Monday. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.